I had already switched off my translation device, so I don't know how it was introduced. So my name is Wolfgang Peter Michel. I'm a freelance researcher for the Blade Museum in Solingen. And I'm a substitute for Dr. Sixt Wetzler, who originally wanted to come here. He's head of the museum, and unfortunately he had a very urgent business that kept him from coming here, and he sends his kindest regards and asks for your forgiveness for not being here today. And I want to introduce you to our project Mefekit Solingen, which we started last year. And we started it because in 2024 the city of Solingen will celebrate the 650th anniversary of the granting of its town charter. And we at the museum started to think about what we could contribute to this celebration. And we want to do a special exhibition on the 16th and 17th century sword making in Solingen, because that was the heyday of Solingen sword making, and we want to show the beautiful pieces the museum has in its collection. And at the first stage of the project, the following results were achieved. We searched our collection on Solingen blades of this time span, and we found that we have 165 blades of the 16th and 17th centuries, which is quite a good amount, and we have a big variety of high quality blades of all the important families and swordsmith dynasties of this time. And but soon we found out when we read the old inventory books that about 30 of these blades, that makes 1/5, had been quite heavily modified after they were acquired by the museum. That means the former heads of the museum, namely in the 1970s and the 1980s, they decided, well, with one of the or the other blade, oh, this hilt, it doesn't really fit the blade. We are going to change it with the hilt of whatever other piece we have. So hilts were swapped sometimes several times within a decade. And from today's view, that is more or less the original sin, because one is not supposed to be that normative when acquiring an ancient sword. And this re-hilting processes with German accuracy, they have been noted in the inventory books. So we know what has been done, but we decided not to try to get back to the original state, because that would mean again to touch the blade and to modify it in a way. So nevertheless, that showed us that the mounting, the hilting of the blade of a 400 and 500-year-old blade is not always reliable, because re-hilting was quite a common thing to do. So we concentrated our analysis on really on the blades of the swords we had. And when we analyzed the stamp marks we found on the blades, we started doing a catalog of all the known swordsmiths in Solingen and their trademarks. And because this, in this extent, didn't exist before, the ground laying research on Solingen blades of this time span have been made in the 1920s. And catalog had already been started at this time, but it was never finished. And an American, Mr. Bezdek, he tried the same with all the German trademarks in, I think, the 1990s. But of course, his catalog, at least concerning the Solingen trademarks, is also not doesn't reach the full extent. So we combined the known catalogs to one big catalog and added all the trademarks we found that were not listed there. And this is a work still in progress. It will be made publicly available online within the next years. And we are happy if people contribute to this catalog. Any museum, private collector who has pieces with unknown stamp marks or unknown names of swordsmiths, he will make us happy if he or she contacts us and provides this information. And we did a summary of the current state of research on Solingen swordsmiths of the 60th and 70th century. We wanted to do an archival research as well in the Solingen City Archive, but because of COVID-19, the Solingen City Archive wasn't accessible at all because its staff was commissioned to tracking infectious chains or in the pandemic. So the archive was as closed as possible, and it wasn't even to us as a museum, it wasn't accessible at all. So this work is left for 2022, when hopefully COVID-19 is that much under control that the archive can open again. And it will be interesting to find whatever of all the documents that was already accessed in the 1920s. What of these documents is left, because Solingen was heavily bombed in 1944 and nearly completely destroyed, and the archive was affected as well. So we'll see what is left and what documents we can find that have not yet been excerpted. And another next step for 2022 will be a metallurgical testing of selected blades with non-destructive methods. And I found this the speech of Stefan Meder very interesting about the polished surfaces and what can be read about out of them. And I'm sure we will contact Mr. Meder and try to get his help for analyzing the blades. Well, let's have a look at the conditional framework for blade making in Solingen, which was in a way different to the Belluno area, but which has quite a few parallels as well, because Solingen found itself in quite a favorable location for blade making, blade manufacture. It is located in a low mountain range, which was covered nearly completely by forest at this time. So charcoal was quite easily accessible. And when blade making is assumed to have begun in Solingen, there was iron ore just found on the surface. It could be collected and put in the smelting ovens. And this had expired during the Middle Ages, but in the areas around Solingen there were huge amounts of ore to find on the surfaces. So until the 16th and 17th century there was nearly no ore obtained by mining. It was mostly in the areas that delivered it to Solingen, it was collected on the surfaces. And the city of Solingen is located at the river Wupper, and the Wupper with all its tributaries provided enough water power for powering grinding wheels and later on water-driven hammers. So we have Aqua, Ferro and Fuoco, same as in Belluno, the three factors you need for making blades. And in the 17th century, on which we will focus tonight, Solingen found itself quite in a crisis because it was heavily affected by city fires, by epidemics, by the 30 Years' War, which affected Solingen as well because it was besieged and occupied several times and even plundered. And we had the plague epidemic in Solingen, and as I said, city fires. So that would be enough factors to justify an economic decline. But at least as far as blade making was concerned, this didn't have a real decline. The blades were made in high quantities and high qualities. And Solingen delivered it to, well, in the 30 Years' War, to every party involved in this war. So they really made a fortune of wars as well. Well, how was blade making organized in Solingen? This is again a difference to the Belluno area, because we didn't have only one guild. We had quite a few of them. Blade making was mentioned, first was mentioned in a document dated from 1218 to 1231. It covers that time span. It's a text document, so you can't tell exactly which year is, well, in which year this first mention takes place. But it mentions that a grinder paid tax for running his workshop. And that means, well, in Solingen, blade making was, the labor was very much divided, much more than in the Belluno area. You were either a swordsmith, or you were a grinder and polisher, or a hardener, or a hilt maker. And if you were born as a son of a swordsmith, you were pretty likely to die as a swordsmith and not as a grinder. There were cases in which families have changed the main profession, but mostly that didn't happen, and professions were inherited from the father to the son. And sorry, the guild of the swordsmith was founded before 1401. It's not exactly known when it was founded, because in 1401 it must have already existed for quite a while. This is the first document we have mentioning it. And the guilds were called brotherhoods in Solingen. That already indicates the quasi-religious character they had. They were very strict organizations, and they regulated the trade extremely strict, and not always to the good of its members, which we will see. And the Brotherhood of the Sword Grinders and Polishers was founded in 1412, and the Brotherhood of the Cross and Button Smith, means hilt makers, in 1487. And maybe it was due to the Brotherhood of the Swordsmith being formed at the first place, or maybe because of the major role the swordsmith played in making swords, that this brotherhood for a long time dominated the others. And there was sometimes quite a hostile situation between the different brotherhoods, and long legal issues were fought between them, sometimes on a time span of 40 years or something. And yeah, it was more or less a hostility between these brotherhoods. And above these brotherhoods was it was called the Six Men. It was a gremium, a body that ruled even the brotherhoods, or was had the function of ruling the brotherhoods. But well, they still didn't stop the hostilities. But if whatever decision had to be done over different brotherhoods, this was made by the Six Men. And the swordsmith, as I said, dominated the others. That is seen in the 16th century. Most of the mayors of Solingen had been of the swordsmith trade. And the swordsmith, for a long time, were allowed to set the wages for the other trades. And as the swordsmith at that time had mostly the leading role in creating a sword, which you will see on the next slide, they decided, well, they employed the other trades, and they decided how much to pay them for their work, which is for them quite a luxurious situation, but for the others it must have been quite frustrating. So in the production chain of making swords in the 16th century must have been like this. Indicated in red was the work of the swordsmith, because he was refining his steel by hand and forging raw blades, which were called black goods, Schwarzware in German. That means he was only creating a roughly shaped blade and handed this over to the other trades, like for grinding, hardening, polishing, and decorating and everything, and at least the hilt making. So he left the sword making process at quite an early stage. Nevertheless, he seemed to have been the entrepreneur who decided, or maybe got the contract from a merchant, of how many swords of whatever sort to be made. He made the steel needed for the swords. He shaped the raw blades and then employed the other trades in finishing the blade. That means he pre-financed the creation of the blades, but of course he should have had the most earnings of these blades, being the entrepreneur. And that's pretty unlike the Bolognese way, as far as I've seen here, because Bolognese workshops partly consisted of several fireplaces with bellows and several anvils, maybe several grinding wheels, and so all the trades under one roof. And we never had this in Solingen. The trades were strictly divided, and you had the swordsmith workshop with a fireplace, bellows, and an anvil. And in one case, there was a legal issue because a swordsmith was found to have a grinding wheel in his workshop, and he was prohibited to have that. He was forced to get rid of the grinding wheel because he was not a grinder. So the trades were strictly divided, and the production chain of sword making was characterized by a strict division of labor. That is, as far as I know, unique for the Solingen area of this time, because in other areas like Belluno or Klingenthal in Alsace or Sheffield, it was not strictly divided like this. And the role of the swordsmith as a dominating trade was not unchallenged, as we see in the 17th century, when quite a lot of burdens were put on the swordsmith trade by the brotherhoods, or even by their own brotherhood, because the 16th and still the 17th century can easily be called the heyday of soling and swordsmith trade. And at the beginning of the 17th century, the approximately 100 soling swordsmiths produced up to 200,000 sword blades a year. We can reconstruct this number only by a text document, because the swordsmith brotherhood had to pay 1 gulden of taxes per 100 sword blades made by their guild. And in 1 year, they had to pay 2,000 guldens. I think it was 1628 when they had to pay 2,000 guldens per year. And that adds for 200,000 blades having been made in this year. The swordsmiths had always been restricted by the oath of stay they had to, or the oath of remain. They had to provide when they learned their trade. That means they were not allowed to leave after they acquired their professional secrets. They were not allowed to leave the city of Solingen anymore, even not for whatever travel to expos or whatsoever. They were not allowed to leave. And if they tried to leave, maybe even to leave permanently, and had been caught by doing this or trying to do this, they had been taken away all their personal belongings and sort of banned from their trade. So they were heavily, strictly punished for trying this. And this oath of stay must have hindered them by, well, trading their goods and also acquiring new secrets in sword making, because they were limited to their own circle of persons they knew. And additional to this oath of stay, they were put under a trade ban already in the late 15th century. That meant they were not longer able to trade the goods they had manufactured. They had to have middlemen, merchants, to do the trading for them. And of course, that cost them quite a lot of their earnings, because they had to pay the middleman, of course. And from the mid-16th century, it was 1565, they were even banned from trading sword blades with the other trades, because before they could have made black goods, roughly shaped blades, and then trade them to the grinders, and by this keep their earnings. And now they were even banned from trading these goods to the other blade making trades. That meant free entrepreneurship was more or less impossible for them. They were made service providers for the merchants. Additionally to that, another burden, they were put under what was called the Gebühr in German, that is the limit. They were limited to doing not more than 4 blades a day. And with even better techniques of forging, which improved with the years, they could have easily done more than 4 blades a day. And they started a legal issue against this limit, which lasted nearly 40 years and ended with the defeat of the swordsmith. So they haven't been able to get rid of this limit. They were only able to soften it in the way that it wasn't meant 4 blades per workshop, but 4 blades per employed worker. So if they had employed blacksmiths, or there was a time when they even employed kids just to get the limit extended by their heads, to extend their limit and make more blades than these 4 that had originally been allowed. And if they had to fulfill a contract in a very short time, it is known that several bladesmiths have combined their workforce and their limits under one contract, and so they work together on this to fulfill this contract. And the other swordsmith employed, they stamped their products with the stamp mark of the contractor. Yeah, they were quite creative in handling this limit, but it must have still been, well, a limitation of their trade if they are not allowed to make as many blades as possible. So another burden that was put on them was and that must be unbelievable for Bellunese sword makers. They were banned from using steel from water-driven hammers. By tradition, as I said, the swordsmiths did their steel by hand, did it by themselves. And the first water-driven hammers occurred in the Solingen region about the second half of the 16th century, which is quite late compared to the Bellunese region. And before, everything was done by hand. And in one of the regions that delivered steel half-finished products to the Solingen bladesmith, it was the region of the city of Breckerfeld. In this area, there is a document that is about a legal complaint of the Guild of the Steelmakers in the city of Breckerfeld, who complained that a water-driven hammer was put up in the city area, was erected in the city area, and I can quote the document. The guild complains that on the hammer, which is powered by water, more steel can be made in a week than can be produced by the whole steel guild, which works by hand almost in half a year. So quite prehistoric way of steel making in the Solingen area compared to the Bellunese. But that was the way the guilds had decided. Maybe to slow down competition and or to keep up quality. There are indications that steel from water-driven hammers was considered of a minor quality, which was nonsense, of course. But yeah, that was another burden put on the sword smith, not to use half-finished products made from these water hammers. It is only from 1680 in the Solingen area that the swordsmith gradually began to use steel from water hammers, maybe secretly at first, or maybe it was maybe even a case of bribery, I don't know. And it was not until 1715 that the Solingen swordsmiths were officially allowed to use steel from the water hammers with the permission of the brotherhoods, and no longer had to forge their own steel or to create their own steel by hand. So, yeah, so this is quite a different way of approaching sword making compared to the Bellunese area, I reckon. But still, as I mentioned, the output of the Solingen sword industry was quite impressive. And of course, they exported their goods to all over Europe and the known world. So what happened to the sword-making production chain by this change? And in this slide I have made a mistake, because in the first line, refining steel, I have written it was done by the swordsmith. And exactly this is not true anymore, because this was now done by the water hammers. And the only work that was left for the swordsmiths was forging semi-finished products into raw blades, because the rest of the production chain kept unchanged. So the role of the swordsmith in the production chain has diminished, and couldn't be considered that important anymore. And this mirrors the decline of the social role the swordsmith must have played in the Solingen society, because he was not able to trade the goods anymore, and his role in producing them wasn't that dominant anymore. So it became the merchants who had the leading role in this process. And in the 18th century, which was to follow, you see it from the mayors of Solingen that were mostly or pretty often merchants by then, by profession. And what I personally find interesting in this change of production chain, and I have not yet found too much hints about how it was done, is because the quality of the steel and the properties of the steel must have been communicated from one trade to the other. The steel makers must have told the swordsmiths what they get, because you can't make high quality swords from a steel from unknown analysis. And it is known that the water hammers that delivered steel to and semi-finished products to the swordsmith in Solingen, they produced 3 grades of quality. Grade 1 was used for knife blades and tool blades. Grade 2 was usable for low quality swords like infantry swords. And grade 3 was highest quality. It was suitable for high quality swords. And but still, this didn't say what sort of ore was used, from which region, what was the composition of the alloy, what was the amount of carbon. Of course, at that time they had no means of measuring this. They had only their experience and judging the steel by its color, by its color when it's heated. And I find it very impressive that with the technological knowledge of this time, that they must have been able to communicate the properties of the steel they had, because when the swordsmith delivered the raw blade as black good to the grinder and hardener, the blade was not tempered by the person who forged it. And so again, the swordsmith must have communicated to the hardener what sort of steel he used and how he treated it, and how it had to be heat treated. Because if you are familiar with heat treating of modern steels, it is quite different if it's heated to 850 degrees or 1050 degrees, how long it is held in this temperature, and how often it is quenched in a cooling agent, and then how at what temperature it is annealed to soften it a little bit after the hardening process that makes it quite brittle. So all the trades that had been directly connected to the steel qualities, like the steel makers, the swordsmith and the hardeners, they must have had enormous experience about how to treat a steel of unknown analysis, which I find absolutely fascinating. Well, the decline of importance of the swordsmith trade, leaves as I said, the social role of the swordsmith not untouched, because he became less important in the chain of production. They still, well, they used to be proud master craftsmen who, well, confidently do the end product with "May fake it, Solingen." Solingen has made me, and their famous stamp marks. And they still provided their name and their trademark for the finished product, but the quality of the finished product wasn't that much connected to their work anymore, because it was a merchant who decided which steel to obtain from the steel mills, and it was the merchant who decided which trades, which hardener and which grinder he employed for finishing the blade. So the end product still bore the name of the famous swordsmith, but the swordsmith, well, wasn't responsible for its quality anymore. So if the 16th and 17th century could be called the age of the swordsmith in Solingen, the 18th century became the age of the merchant in Solingen. So this is about what I wanted to tell you about the Solingen way of swordsmithing, and I thank you very much for your attention. Grazie per la attenzione.
Grazie.
And if any questions will arise, I will be happy to at least try to answer them.
Grazie per l'accurata descrizione del distretto di Solingen, di cui io sapevo pochissimo, tra parentesi. Grazie.